If the French Third Republic had decided to invade the Kingdom of Belgium before the German Empire did, it would have certainly complicated relations between the United Kingdom and France, and in turn, with the United States. However, the question remains, would France's invasion of Belgium in 1914 have led to a quicker victory over the Central Powers, or would it have caused new complications that ultimately resulted in the victory of Germany, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire? You will learn about this in this video. As I mentioned in the introduction, the reason France was reluctant to invade Belgium first was simple. If they had done this, the United Kingdom would have had no reason to enter the war on the side of France and Russia. Since its founding in 1830, Belgium was conceived as a buffer state between France and the Netherlands, but primarily between France and Prussia. Later Germany. The independence of this kingdom was guaranteed by Britain, and if France attacked it, relations between the British and French would become significantly complicated. It should also be remembered that the Entente was originally a defensive alliance. If French troops crossed the border into Belgium, Paris would be seen as an aggressor alongside Germany, influencing public opinion in both Britain and the United States. Neither the people nor the Parliament knew that Britain was actually in a military alliance with France. It may seem strange, but both Prime Ministers Esquvet and Foreign Minister Grey denied in Parliament that the Entente was a military alliance, as the people in Parliament were against war and did not want to be drawn into the Franco-German conflict again. What would have happened if France had decided to occupy Belgium before Germany? Firstly, Britain would have lost its reason to participate in this new conflict. This was especially evident in the sentiments within political parties. The ruling Conservative Party was most enthusiastic in supporting France against Germany, while the Liberal Party was only willing to support the French in defense of Belgium from German aggression. One can imagine the risk of a political crisis in Britain if they entered the war on the side of the aggressor attacking neutral Belgium. The British would begin to support the French divisions financially and materially, while quickly reducing trade with the Central Powers, but would not officially enter the war. Essentially, Britain would try to help France indirectly, but would not be ready to participate in the Great War. As for military actions, the French could certainly occupy the western part of Belgium. However, I believe that crossing the River M would be quite difficult due to the resistance of the Belgian population and French troops. The formation of uniforms made the German artillery even more effective and accurate. At the same time, all major French provinces would be under the control of Paris, allowing factories and power plants to better supply themselves with coal, which was mainly mined in the northeast of France. Instead of being occupied, the country would be on the offensive, which would mean less of its territory would be destroyed. Even more than 100 years after the Great War, the Rogue Zone in France would remain inaccessible to people due to numerous unexploded bombs and toxic chemicals still present in the soil. In this alternative history, none of this would have happened, or at least not on French soil, as Belgium would have become a battleground between France and Germany. Its local population would have suffered greatly, being drawn into a conflict to which they were originally unrelated. Initially, the French population would have shown more enthusiasm, but the occupation of the claimed territory of Alsace would also have proven to be an extremely difficult task. As for the Ottoman Empire, considering that the currently inactive Britain was ready to provide warships on the coast of Anatolia, the chances of the Ottoman Empire joining the war on the side of the Central Powers could diminish, at least for a while. Perhaps at the beginning of 2015, the Ottoman Empire and the British Empire would not have participated in the war, but this would only delay their entry into the opposing sides. To understand this, it is worth noting that in Ottoman society there were two factions: conservatives, who were mainly supporters of Germany, and liberals, more inclined towards France and Britain. I believe the Ottomans could support the Central Powers sooner or later, probably right after Italy, which long claimed the Italian population in western Slovenia, Istria, and Zadar, joins the conflict and declares war on the Central Powers. It was precisely due to Italy's invasion, followed by the First Balkan War, that the Ottomans were forced to leave the Balkan Peninsula, retreating to Constantinople. Thus, Sultan Mehmed V sought revenge against this Mediterranean state. Great Britain would also officially join the war on the side of France, Italy, and Russia after the Ottoman Empire officially entered the conflict on the side of the Central Powers. Public opinion in the United States, due to democratic France's attack on neutral democratic Belgium, would begin to perceive the Entente as the more aggressive side. Americans would see Belgium as a war zone, where locals became victims of war crimes from both sides, and their territory was polluted and heavily destroyed due to the actions of France. One can imagine that all the troubles that befell France in the Great War would now descend upon small and weak Belgium, while hardly touching the main French territories. Dantin, showing greater aggression than the Central Powers, is a matter of perspective. Yes, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia and Germany on Russia, but on the other hand, it was the Serbian assassins, financed by the Serbian government, who killed the Austro-Hungarian heir to the throne, Franz Ferdinand. Both opinions have the right to exist, and propaganda will act from both sides, trying to determine who is more guilty. Such a multifaceted American public existed at that time. However, because the Germans invaded neutral Belgium, Germany was perceived as the main empire of evil, seeking to establish its dominance over the European continent. Now, France would occupy half of Belgium, which split American public opinion 50-50, making it impossible to finance both France and the UK without the discontent of half the population. Nevertheless, one can imagine that they could provide humanitarian aid and grants to Belgium through neutral Netherlands. As for the year 1915, after Bulgaria entered the war against Serbia, the Serbian and Montenegrin fronts quickly collapsed, and the Serbian army, led by the Serbian government and royal family, was forced to flee to Albania and then to Italy, where it continued to fight. Russia would have been supplied through the Bosporus and Dardanelles much longer, giving the Russians a slightly more advantageous position. Germany would also find itself in a better position, as Britain would not have joined the conflict immediately, and the British naval blockade would start to harm the German economy a bit later than in our history. The following year, 1916, will mark an unpleasant turn for Russia. It will be forced to leave Poland and will face great difficulties in liberating Armenia from the Ottoman army, which will be better armed thanks to Germany. Italy, after a brief occupation of Trentino, begins to lose the Venetian province. Just like in our history, France, with the support of the Flemish and Walloons, will be pushed out of Belgium but will still retain control over its key provinces. Great Britain will be able to capture most of the German colonies and successfully defend the Suez Canal. However, the subsequent Gallipoli campaign will end just as it did in our history. This will further anger the British, especially the Indian, Australian, and New Zealand populations, forcing British commanders to take a defensive stance to prevent unnecessary losses. As for the uprising in Ireland, considering that Britain entered this world conflict in less than a year, I assume that this revolution will also happen later, either in the autumn of the same year, when it will no longer be called an uprising, or at least in the spring of 1917. The American government, led by a kind president, will likely start sending humanitarian aid there. It will not be weapons or ammunition, but medicines, clothing, and basic food supplies that will be sent to Ireland, which will not pose a problem for the British, as it will help reduce tensions on the island for the remainder of the year. The British gradually strengthened their power on the southern coast of the Arabian Peninsula, while the French successfully repelled German attacks. Meanwhile, the Russians were gradually being pushed out of Lithuania and western Lithuania. However, thanks to the advance of the Central Powers, eastern Galicia was regained, which could have prompted Romania to join the war on Dan's side. This happened because the Austro-Hungarian army was initially in a much worse state than in our real history, as the Russian army at that time was even stronger. The Romanian army managed to occupy half of Transylvania, but unfortunately lost Wallachia and Dobruja to neighboring Bulgaria. As for the next year, the overthrow of the king will not happen until autumn due to the weakened Austro-Hungary, but the subsequent chain of events will be more or less the same. In the summer of 1917, the German army finally managed to break through French positions, taking control of key territories in France, which in our history, Germany began to control only after successfully executing the Schlieffen Plan. Italy, despite some losses in the Austrian Alps, will be forced to retreat from most of the Venetian province, except for the city of Venice. Meanwhile, Greece will completely lose control over western Thrace and all of eastern Macedonia, although the country will not yet enter the war, but a national split will occur, dividing it into two parts, polarized over which side of the conflict it should align with. Meanwhile, the British finally managed to regain control over Hejaz on the Arabian Peninsula with the support of local tribes. Residents of English, Scottish, Welsh, and Irish cities have begun to actively protest against the war, as the British had much weaker reasons for entering the conflict than in our real history. After the Romanian army was driven out of Transylvania and the Russian army from eastern Galicia, the patience of the poor inhabitants of the Orthodox Empire began to wear thin. Before spring of 1918, Finland declares independence, while the Bolsheviks successfully seize St. Petersburg, Moscow, and all Russian cities. In spring, Leon Trotsky signs the Brest Peace, meaning that Russia is finally exiting the war, which begins to cause quiet panic in both the United Kingdom and France. One should not forget that the consequences of the invasion of neutral Belgium by French troops stripped away any sympathy that Americans might have felt for Western Europe. The German Emperor Wilhelm II will be smart enough to understand that under these conditions, it is not worth seeking new allies across the Atlantic, so he will not send the Zimmermann telegram to Mexico. There is a possibility that the United States could remain neutral. The society in the country is highly polarized regarding which side to take in the conflict, which could lead American leadership to hesitate in taking active measures so as not to anger half of its population. They might simply observe the unfolding events. As for Great Britain and France, despite the occupation of Palestine, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq, which resulted from the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, the defeat of the Central Powers would have been inevitable without the support of the American army. Germany would have been in a stronger position until May 1915, allowing it to maintain a more stable economy and standard of living during the war. Austria-Hungary would have found itself in a more difficult situation due to the presence of a larger Russian army in Poland. Nevertheless, I do not think the Habsburg Empire would have collapsed despite the temporary loss of Transylvania, as it would only strengthen the determination of the Hungarian population to prevent their historical land from being taken by Little Romania. Bulgaria would not have capitulated, as Britain and Greece would have been more defensively inclined. I suppose that Germany could have occupied Paris at the end of 1918, which would not have meant immediate surrender for France, but could have led to that for Britain, as the population of the country would have demanded an immediate end to the war. The British public saw no sense in the war, as they entered the conflict to support France, which had violated Belgium's neutrality, while Paris itself entered the war because of Russia, which had already surrendered. Thus, it would make no sense for the British to continue fighting in a foreign war, and public pressure would force them to withdraw from the conflict the following winter after an unsuccessful attempt to retake Paris. The French government would be forced to officially acknowledge defeat, as Russia and Britain had already exited the war, and the United States showed no desire to support France. In fact, they were indirectly financing the Belgians. Italy, on the brink of state bankruptcy, would likely side with the Central Powers to gain at least French Sardinia or Tunisia. However, considering the nature of the Italians, they might simply exit the war by signing a conditional surrender with the Central Powers. As for the peace conference, it could take place in Berlin, where decisions would be made about new borders, the redistribution of colonies, and military operations. In Asia, the Germans would have received the southern part of New Guinea and French territories in China, where a rebellion would likely occur, suppressed by the new German colonial administration. The British would not have lost much, except for their colonies south of Tanganyika, apart from South Africa. The country will gain independence but maintain ties with the British Empire. After the capitulation of the Ottoman Empire, the British Empire will be able to hold on to its colonies on the Arabian Peninsula. However, Hijaz, Yemen, and Tuman will be annexed by Saudi Arabia to foster better relations. The weakened Ottoman Empire will retain the Caucasus, Palestine, Jordan, and Lebanon, and will also acquire the Dodecanese Islands from Italy. I assume they might also get Cyprus, but it depends on Britain's mood. I assume that the Ottoman Sultanate was not abolished, and the revolutionaries would gradually be arrested or executed. Bulgaria would find itself in the best position, gaining its required territories without major wars, Macedonia and the Nish province. In Greece, Constantine I will return to the throne, restoring absolute monarchy. As for Serbia and Montenegro, considering that the Austro-Hungarian army has significantly weakened, Charles I will be able to establish garrisons in these territories. Serbia and Montenegro will be protected by internal secret police, but will effectively function as independent countries within the Austro-Hungarian sphere of influence and common economy, which is close to the status quo before the war, making World War I somewhat meaningless. France, as I mentioned, will lose territories in China and likely in northern Belgian Congo, which will be governed by Germany. As compensation, it will also have to cede the province of Epirus in Belgium, although it has been attacked. However, the French northeastern territories with the largest coal reserves will remain under French control, as Germany needs manpower to protect Eastern Europe from the Bolsheviks, who will be fighting the Czechoslovak Legion and the White Army in Siberia at this time. Finland will become a constitutional monarchy under the leadership of a German nobleman and a social democratic government, while Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania will form a united Baltic duchy, also governed by a German nobleman, possibly Vyacheslav Karen, from the Polish Congress. The Kingdom of Poland will be established under the leadership of the Bulgarian noble Cyril I, while the Kingdom of Ukraine will be led by A.R. Duke Van from Austria, also known as the Ukrainian nationalist Vasily Vyshyvanets. As for Russia, since Czechoslovakia does not exist and probably never will, the Czechoslovak Legion will have no reason to return home and may be immediately arrested, as the Legion fought against Austria-Hungary, trying to overthrow its former nation to create an independent Czechoslovak state.